There's a stretch of time, and if you're honest with yourself, you might be living in it right now, where everything you built starts coming apart. The relationship you were sure about suddenly cracks down the middle. The career you spent years constructing begins to feel like a costume that no longer fits your body. Friendships you assumed would last forever go quiet, and you can't even explain why. Your motivation disappears. Your sense of direction dissolves. You wake up in the morning, and the life you're looking at doesn't feel like yours anymore, and you don't know whose it is or how you got here. Most people experience this and assume they've made a terrible mistake somewhere. They think they took a wrong turn, missed a signal, broke something important through negligence or bad decisions. The panic sets in. They scramble to put things back together, to rebuild what's crumbling, to force the old shape of their life to hold. And when it won't hold, when the pieces keep slipping through their fingers no matter how hard they grip, they conclude something is deeply wrong with them. Jung watched this pattern unfold in patient after patient across decades of practice, and what he found was the exact opposite of what those patients believed. The collapse they were experiencing, the dismantling of everything familiar, the terrifying sense that their entire life was being demolished from the inside out. This was the single most reliable predictor of profound transformation he'd ever documented. Every person who eventually arrived at what Jung considered a genuinely meaningful, authentic life had first passed through a period that felt like complete destruction. Every single one. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about this pattern, why your life has to fall apart before the best chapter can begin, what's actually happening in your psyche during the demolition, the specific phases you move through, and why each one feels unbearable, and how to tell whether the collapse you're experiencing right now is the threshold of something extraordinary rather than the catastrophe it appears to be. Jung's patients would come in during these periods looking shattered. They'd describe the same thing in different words. Everything that used to work has stopped working. Relationships that sustained them felt hollow. Goals that once drove them seemed meaningless. Identities they'd spent their whole adult lives constructing suddenly felt like elaborate lies. And the worst part, the part that scared them most, was that they couldn't force themselves to care about rebuilding any of it. The desire itself had died. They didn't just lose their life structure, they lost the motivation to reconstruct it. Their friends and family would tell them to snap out of it, see a doctor, take a vacation, try harder, get back on track. And the patients would sit in Jung's office and say some version of the same confession. I can't go back. I know everyone wants me to go back. I know I should want to go back. But something in me refuses, and I don't understand what's happening. Jung understood what was happening. He'd seen it enough times to recognize the signature. What looked like a psychological crisis, what the patient experienced as loss and failure and collapse, was actually the psyche initiating a massive reorganization. The old structures were being torn down because they had to be torn down. They were built on foundations that couldn't support who this person was becoming. And the psyche, in its ruthless wisdom, was doing what the conscious mind would never volunteer to do, destroying everything that was false so something real could finally emerge. This is the part that terrifies people. The psyche doesn't ask permission. It doesn't send a polite notice saying, "We'll be renovating your identity over the next 18 months. Please make alternative arrangements." It just starts pulling the walls down, and from the inside, it feels like madness. It feels like everything you've worked for is being taken from you. It feels like punishment. But Jung saw it differently. He saw it the way a demolition engineer sees a condemned building being brought down. The building looks fine from the outside. People are confused about why it's being destroyed. But the engineer has seen the foundation, knows the structural damage is too severe, understands that patching and painting will only delay the inevitable. The building has to come down so something sound can be constructed in its place. The demolition looks like destruction. It is destruction, but the destruction serves creation. That's what Jung observed in every patient who eventually reached genuine psychological wholeness. The best chapter of their life was always preceded by what felt like the worst chapter. Always. He never found an exception to this pattern. The depth of the collapse was proportional to the scale of the transformation waiting on the other side. Small collapses preceded small shifts. Total demolitions preceded total reinventions. The math was brutal but consistent. So let's look at what actually falls apart during this period and why it has to. The first thing that collapses is your persona, the version of yourself you've been performing for the world. Jung used the term persona deliberately, borrowing it from the Latin word for the masks actors wore in ancient theater. Your persona is the mask you built in response to what your environment demanded. Maybe your family needed you to be the responsible one, so you built a persona around competence and reliability. Maybe your social world rewarded achievement, so you constructed an identity around success. Maybe your early relationships taught you that being needed was the only reliable way to be loved, so you became the helper, the fixer, the one everyone depends on. These personas aren't random, they're survival strategies. You built them because they worked. They got you approval, safety, belonging, love, or at least reasonable facsimiles of those things. And they worked for years, maybe decades, until one day they didn't, and you couldn't figure out why the mask that had always fit suddenly felt like it was suffocating you. Jung found that the persona collapses when it can no longer contain the person underneath. You've been growing, changing, developing in ways your conscious mind hasn't fully registered, and the mask you built at 20 or 25 or 30 can't accommodate who you've become. It's like wearing shoes 3 sizes too small. For a while you can ignore the pain. You can convince yourself the shoes are fine, but eventually your feet demand room, and the shoes have to go. When the persona starts cracking, it feels like an identity crisis because that's exactly what it is. You don't know who you are without the mask. You've been wearing it so long you forgot there was a face underneath. People around you get uncomfortable because they related to the mask, and now the mask is slipping, and they don't recognize what's emerging. Some of them will try to push the mask back on. They'll tell you you've changed, and they won't mean it as a compliment. They'll say they want the old you back. What they mean is they want the performance back, because the performance was predictable, and the real person underneath is unknown territory. This is where relationships start falling apart, and Jung was very clear about why. The relationships that were built around your persona can only survive if the persona survives. When the mask drops, every connection that was attached to the mask rather than to you becomes unstable. Some relationships will deepen when the real person emerges. These are the ones that were always reaching past the performance towards something genuine. But many relationships will end because the person on the other side was never in relationship with you. They were in relationship with your mask, and when the mask goes, so does the connection. Losing these relationships is devastating even when you sense, somewhere beneath the pain, that they needed to end, because the loss confirms your deepest fear during this period. I'm becoming someone unrecognizable, and the people I love can't follow me there. Jung acknowledged how brutal this was. He never minimized it. But he also observed that the relationships that fell away during persona collapse were almost always ones that required the person to remain small, false, or frozen in an outdated version of themselves. The demolition was selective. It targeted what was built on pretense and left what was built on truth. The second thing that collapses is your sense of meaning. The goals that used to drive you, the achievements that used to satisfy you, the framework you used to organize your life around. All of it starts feeling hollow. You might still be succeeding by every external measure. The promotion comes, the milestone is reached, the thing you worked toward materializes, and you feel nothing. Or worse, you feel a kind of nauseous emptiness, like you climbed a very long ladder and reached the top, only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall. Jung would have called this the collapse of provisional meaning. Most people build their sense of purpose around external structures: career, status, accumulation, approval. These meanings work for the first half of life because they align with what society rewards. You're building, achieving, establishing yourself, and the doing of it generates enough momentum that you don't have to ask whether any of it actually matters to you on a level deeper than social programming. But there comes a point, and Jung observed this most often in the middle years, though it can happen at any age, where the externally sourced meaning runs dry. The achievements don't satisfy. The goals feel empty. The life that looked perfect from the outside reveals itself as a beautifully furnished room with no oxygen. You can't breathe in it anymore, and you can't explain why, because nothing visibly changed. The room is the same. You're the one who's different. This collapse of meaning is terrifying because meaning is how we orient ourselves. Without it, you're floating, directionless. The things you used to reach for with urgency now sit at the edge of your attention like objects in someone else's house, familiar but irrelevant. And the new meaning, the thing that's trying to emerge, hasn't taken shape yet. You're in the gap between what no longer works and what hasn't yet arrived, and the gap feels endless. People in this gap often became deeply depressed, and he was careful to distinguish this particular depression from the pathological kind. This depression had a purpose. It was the psyche withdrawing energy from the old structures, pulling the life force out of pursuits and goals that no longer served the person's actual development. The depression felt like something dying because something was dying. The old meaning system was being starved of energy so a new one could eventually grow. But the person experiencing it didn't know that. They just knew they couldn't care about anything, and the emptiness was swallowing them. The third thing that collapses is your relationship with yourself. And this is the deepest demolition, the one that makes the others feel manageable by comparison. During this phase, the internal voice that's been narrating your life, the one that says, "I'm a good person, I'm strong, I know who I am," starts contradicting itself. You begin to see things about yourself that the persona was designed to hide. The selfishness underneath your generosity, the fear underneath your confidence, the need for control underneath your flexibility. The parts of yourself you've spent your entire life disowning start surfacing, and they don't come politely. Jung would have called this the confrontation with the shadow, and he considered it the most critical phase of any genuine transformation. Your shadow is everything you decided was unacceptable about yourself. The qualities you rejected, the impulses you buried, the aspects of your humanity you exiled because your environment punished them. Every person alive carries a shadow because every person alive was taught that certain parts of themselves were wrong, bad, or dangerous. During the collapse period, the shadow stops staying hidden. It pushes through the cracks in the failing persona like water through a crumbling dam. You start seeing your own manipulations, your own dishonesty, the ways you've used kindness as currency, the ways you've performed virtue while harboring resentments. The gap between who you've claimed to be and who you've actually been becomes impossible to ignore. This confrontation is so painful that many people abort the entire transformation to avoid it. They rebuild the old persona as fast as they can. They find new distractions, new goals, new relationships to pour themselves into, anything to avoid sitting with the shadow material that's surfacing. And it works, temporarily. You can reconstruct the mask, you can push the shadow back down. But Jung observed that the psyche will initiate the demolition again, and the next time it will be more severe, because the structures you're rebuilding are even more false than before. You're now building on top of ruins, and ruins make unstable foundations. The people who move through this confrontation, who actually sit with what surfaces and let themselves see it, describe it as the worst thing they've ever experienced and the most important thing they've ever done. Because on the other side of seeing your shadow is the possibility of actually integrating it, claiming the rejected parts, becoming whole rather than performing a curated half. And wholeness, in Jung's framework, was the foundation on which genuine life was built. You can't construct the best chapter of your life while disowning half of who you are. The math doesn't work. The shadow has to be faced before anything real can be built. There's a phase Jung documented that occurs after the major demolitions, but before any reconstruction begins. And it's the phase that breaks people, or makes them. He would have described it as a kind of night sea journey, a passage through absolute psychological darkness where nothing familiar remains and nothing new has yet appeared. You've lost the old persona. The old meanings are gone. You've confronted your shadow and you can't unsee what you saw. And now you're sitting in the rubble, and the rubble is just rubble, and you cannot see what comes next. If you're recognizing this space, if you're living in the rubble right now, surveying the demolished landscape of a life that used to make sense, what I want you to understand is that the emptiness you're feeling has a function. And if working through this period is something you're navigating, the 24 reflection exercises in our guide, True Self-Discovery, were designed with exactly this passage in mind. Rooted in Jung's framework for self-understanding, they give you a way to do the inner work this phase demands, not to rush through it, but to move through it with more clarity. Click below to get true self-discovery. This empty space, this psychological no-man's land between who you were and who you're becoming, was where the actual transformation happened. And it happened in the emptiness precisely because the emptiness was necessary. As long as the old structures filled the space, there was no room for anything new. The demolition created a void, and the void was the prerequisite. You can't plant in soil that's already occupied. The ground has to be cleared first. But cleared ground looks like devastation. It looks like loss. It looks like you're standing in the ruins of your life with nothing to show for all the years you spent building. And every instinct you have is screaming at you to start rebuilding immediately. Fill the void, replace the relationships, find new goals, construct a new identity, do anything to escape the terrible openness of having nothing solid to stand on. Jung warned against this impulse with everything he had, because the rush to rebuild is how people end up constructing a second false life on top of the ruins of the first one. They haven't sat in the emptiness long enough to hear what's actually trying to emerge. They haven't let the silence teach them anything. They've just grabbed the nearest materials and started building out of panic. And what they build is another version of what collapsed. Slightly different on the surface, structurally identical underneath. The people who let the emptiness exist, who tolerate the discomfort of not knowing, not having, not being anything recognizable, are the ones who eventually hear something emerging from the silence. Jung described it as the voice of the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche that operates beneath the ego's frantic activity. The self knows what you're actually supposed to be building. It has the blueprint, but you can only hear it when you stop trying to fill the silence with your own plans. This is what makes the transition so agonizing. The ego wants to be in charge of the rebuilding. It wants to design the next chapter according to its preferences, its fears, its ambitions. But the ego is what built the last chapter, the one that had to be demolished because it was false. Letting the ego run the reconstruction is like letting the architect who designed the condemned building design the replacement. Something deeper has to take over, and the only way it can take over is if the ego learns to sit still and listen rather than scramble and construct. Jung observed that this listening period varied enormously from person to person. For some, it lasted months. For others, years. The duration depended on how deeply the old structures were embedded and how willing the person was to genuinely sit with uncertainty. People who fought the process, who kept trying to force answers, manufacture meaning, rush into new identities, extended it. People who surrendered to the not knowing, who let themselves be genuinely lost without demanding an immediate map, moved through it faster. The paradox was consistent. The more you tried to escape the void, the longer you stayed in it. The more you accepted it, the sooner something real began forming. What forms first isn't a grand plan or a sudden revelation. It's much quieter than that. It's a whisper of genuine desire, the first thing you've wanted in months that doesn't feel borrowed from someone else's expectations. Maybe it's a pull towards something you abandoned years ago because it wasn't practical. Maybe it's a sudden clarity about what you actually value versus what you were taught to value. Maybe it's just a feeling, barely verbal, that says, this direction, here. Jung considered these whispers sacred, and he urged his patients to follow them even when they seemed small or irrational. Because the self doesn't announce itself with fanfare, it speaks through quiet attraction, through what genuinely interests you when no one is watching, through the things that make you lose track of time. After the demolition, when the ego's agenda has been stripped away, these small, authentic signals are the first signs that the rebuilding has begun, and that this time, it's being built on real foundations. The rebuilding itself looks nothing like what most people expect. It doesn't resemble the old life with a fresh coat of paint. It often looks, from the outside, like a step backward. The person might leave a prestigious career for something simpler, might choose solitude over a social life that drained them, might pursue something their old self would have considered beneath them, or impractical, or embarrassing. The new chapter doesn't conform to anyone else's definition of success, because it's being built according to a blueprint that has nothing to do with external validation and everything to do with internal truth. People in the early stages of rebuilding often felt embarrassed or confused by what they were drawn toward. It didn't match the ambitions they'd held before the collapse. It didn't align with what their family or culture considered worthwhile. And because they were still partially identified with the old persona, the demolition takes time and echoes of the mask linger, they would sometimes dismiss their genuine impulses as regression or midlife crisis or foolishness. But the people who followed those impulses anyway, who honored the quiet voice of the self, even when it contradicted everything the ego had planned, were the ones who eventually arrived at what Jung considered the best chapter. And what made it the best chapter wasn't that it was easy or impressive or free from difficulty. What made it the best was that it was real. For the first time, they were living a life that actually belonged to them, rather than a life assembled from other people's expectations, worn like a borrowed suit. There's something else Jung documented about this period that rarely gets discussed, and it's important because it's the thing that makes people doubt the entire process is leading anywhere good. During the reconstruction, old wounds surface. Memories you thought you'd processed reappear with fresh intensity. Emotional pain you assumed was behind you shows up demanding attention. And this feels like regression. It feels like you're going backward, getting worse, falling apart all over again. Jung recognized this as part of the process, rather than a failure of it. When the old structures come down, they expose the foundation. And the foundation is where the original wounds live. The childhood injuries, the early abandonments, the formative experiences that shaped everything built on top of them. As long as the superstructure was intact, these wounds were buried, sealed over, inaccessible. The demolition uncovers them, and they have to be addressed before anything new can be built on that ground. This is the phase where people often need support, a therapist, a trusted companion, someone who can witness the excavation without trying to rush it. Because the temptation to seal the wounds back over, to lay new foundations on top of unaddressed pain, is enormous. It hurts to look at this material. It hurts to feel what you've been avoiding feeling, sometimes for decades. And the cultural pressure to move on and stay positive and not dwell on the past makes the necessary work of excavation feel self-indulgent or pathological. But Jung was uncompromising on this point. You cannot build a genuine life on unexamined wounds. The wounds will distort everything constructed above them, bending relationships, warping decisions, sabotaging opportunities, just as they distorted everything in the life that collapsed. The demolition gives you access to the foundation for the first time. Using that access, doing the painful work of actually healing what's down there, is what makes the next chapter structurally sound in a way the previous one never was. There's a particular quality that emerges in people who've completed this cycle: the demolition, the void, the excavation, the slow rebuilding, that Jung described with unmistakable reverence. He called them individuals who had achieved a degree of wholeness, and what he meant was specific. These were people who could hold paradox, who could be gentle and fierce in the same conversation, who could sit with uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately, who could love someone without losing themselves, who could be alone without being lonely, who could say no without guilt and yes without obligation. This wholeness didn't make them perfect. Jung was always emphatic about this. Individuation, his word for the journey towards psychological completeness, didn't produce saints. It produced humans who were aware of their full nature, including the difficult parts. They still had shadows. They still made mistakes. They still experienced pain and confusion and doubt. But they experienced these things with consciousness, rather than being run by them unconsciously. They could feel the pull of an old pattern and choose differently, rather than sleepwalking into repetition. This is what the best chapter actually looks like when you're living it. It's quieter than you'd expect, less dramatic. There's no moment where trumpets sound and the clouds part and you think, "I've arrived." Instead, there's a gradually building sense of solidity, a feeling that the ground beneath your feet is real this time, that the choices you're making come from somewhere genuine rather than somewhere afraid, that the life you're building can actually hold you because it was built by the part of you that knows who you are. People in this chapter often felt simultaneously more humble and more powerful than they'd ever been. More humble because they'd seen their shadow, their smallness, their capacity for self-deception. More powerful because they were no longer spending enormous energy maintaining a false front. The energy that used to go toward performing an identity was suddenly available for actually living, and the difference in vitality was staggering. People who'd been chronically exhausted for years, drained by the constant effort of being someone they weren't, suddenly had more energy than they knew what to do with. The exhaustion had never been about being busy, it had been about being false. There's something Jung emphasized that I think matters deeply for anyone in the middle of this process right now, and it's this: the demolition is not random. Your psyche is not destroying things arbitrarily. The things that are collapsing are the things that need to collapse. The relationships that are ending are the ones that required you to be less than you are. The goals that feel hollow are the ones that were never yours to begin with. The identity that's crumbling was always a construction, and its collapse is evidence that you've outgrown it. This doesn't make it hurt less. Understanding that a surgery is necessary doesn't eliminate the pain of the incision, but it changes your relationship to the pain. Instead of experiencing the collapse as proof that something is wrong with you, you can begin to see it as evidence that something is right with you. Your psyche is healthy enough to refuse the false life, strong enough to tear down what doesn't serve you, even when your conscious mind would have kept the performance running indefinitely. The collapse is your own depth insisting on truth. And this is what Jung meant when he described the process that precedes the best chapter of a person's life. He meant that the psyche will not allow you to remain in a life that's too small for you, too false for you, too borrowed from other people's definitions of who you should be. It will demolish that life from the inside, and it will do so with the same ruthless efficiency that a body uses to fight infection, indifferent to your comfort, focused entirely on your survival and your growth. The demolition feels like the worst thing that's ever happened to you. The void feels like it will never end. The excavation of old wounds feels like pointless cruelty, and the slow, uncertain rebuilding feels nothing like the triumphant reinvention you were promised by movies and self-help books and social media transformation stories. But the chapter that emerges from this process has a quality that nothing built on false foundations can ever achieve. It's yours. Genuinely, completely, irreducibly yours. Built from the materials of your actual nature, rather than from the expectations and prescriptions of others. Designed by the deepest part of your psyche, rather than by your fear. Inhabited by a version of you that doesn't need to perform, or pretend, or contort into shapes that others find comfortable. Jung spent his entire career watching people go through this process, and he never lost his awe at what emerged on the other side. Because the person who comes through the demolition is someone the old persona could never have imagined. They're larger than the mask, more complex than the role, more alive than the performance ever allowed them to be. And the life they build reflects that aliveness in ways that are specific to each person. One might create art, another might simplify everything. Another might finally speak the truth they'd been swallowing for years. The shape of the best chapter is as unique as the person living it, which is exactly the point. It can't be copied or prescribed because it emerges from a depth that is entirely individual. If you're in the demolition right now, if your life is coming apart and you can't stop it and you're terrified, Jung would want you to know something. The terror is appropriate. What's happening is enormous. You are being reorganized at the deepest level, and that process is disorienting and painful and genuinely frightening. Anyone who tells you to just trust the process or stay positive or look on the bright side has never been through what you're going through, or has forgotten what it actually felt like. But the terror doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something is happening, something that requires the complete dismantling of what was false before it can build what is real. Something that has initiated this same devastating, transformative sequence in every person who eventually found a life worth inhabiting. Something that your psyche initiated because it knows, even though you don't yet, what you're capable of becoming when the false structures finally stop blocking the view. There are things you can do during this period that make a difference, even though the process itself can't be controlled or rushed. You can stop fighting the collapse. This doesn't mean giving up. It means recognizing that what's falling was always going to fall, and your energy is better spent navigating the rubble than propping up condemned walls. You can find people who've been through this, people who won't try to fix you or rush you or tell you to be positive, but who can sit with you in the difficulty and confirm that you haven't lost your mind. You can resist the urge to immediately rebuild, to fill the void with the first thing that presents itself, to replace what collapsed with something equally false just because the emptiness is unbearable. And you can begin, slowly, to pay attention to what's emerging from the silence, the quiet signals, the whispers of genuine desire, the barely there impulses that point in directions you never would have chosen when the old structures were still standing. These are the seeds of the next chapter. They're small and they're fragile and they don't look like much, but they're the first honest things that have grown in the cleared ground, and they deserve your attention more than anything else right now. Jung described the journey toward individuation as the most significant task a human being can undertake, and he also acknowledged it was the most difficult. There's no shortcut through the void, no technique that eliminates the pain of shadow confrontation, no strategy that makes the loss of your old identity feel like anything other than death. The process demands everything, and it makes no promises about timing or outcome. But here's what Jung documented consistently across decades of observation. The people who went through this process, all the way through, without aborting it, without rebuilding the old structures, without running from the shadow, arrived somewhere that made every moment of the difficulty meaningful in retrospect. They didn't arrive at perfection. They arrived at authenticity, at lives that fit them, at a depth of experience that the old persona could never have accessed because the old persona was too busy performing to actually live. The best chapter of your life doesn't begin with a lucky break or a sudden inspiration, or the universe finally giving you what you've been manifesting. It begins in the rubble, in the place where everything fell apart and you couldn't put it back together and you had to finally stop trying. It begins when the false self dies and the real self, terrified and blinking, steps into the light for the first time. That stepping forward is the most courageous thing a human being can do. And the life that follows, the chapter that unfolds when you finally start building from truth instead of from fear, is worth every demolished wall, every lost relationship, every excruciating night spent in the void, wondering if you'd ever feel solid again. Jung believed this with everything he had. He'd seen it too many times to doubt it. The demolition always precedes the masterpiece. The void always precedes the vision. The darkness always precedes the dawn that actually belongs to you, the one that breaks across a landscape you recognize, finally, as your own. And if you're sitting in that darkness right now, surrounded by the rubble of everything that used to be your life, unable to see what comes next, here's what decades of Jungian observation would tell you. Something is being built that you can't see yet, something that required exactly this destruction. Something worth every moment of everything you're enduring. The best chapter starts here, in the wreckage, in the uncertainty, in the terrifying, liberating space between who you were and who you haven't yet become. It starts here because it could never have started anywhere else. If you're moving through this passage and looking for a way to do the inner work it demands, our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises grounded in Jung's approach to self-understanding. It was built for exactly this kind of threshold, when the old answers have stopped working and you need to listen more carefully to what's trying to emerge. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.